There is the alternative, and this is the mercurial part. If you're Zelensky, and he was one of the first to congratulate Trump, you might hope that Trump wants to be seen as a winner, that, cutting a deal would be a huge bonus for his way of doing business. And one way to do that would be to open the taps, to somehow force more equipment into the system, to remove some of the caveats on long-range weapons, and, if you like, show that their policy of peace through strength can mean the strength of allies and partners backed by the US. Now, I'm not sure that is really going to come to pass, but that's what Zelensky will probably be hoping.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. And this time we are joined by Matthew Savil. Matthew is the Director of Military Sciences at the London-based think tank RUSI. He focuses on developments and trends in modern conflict. In his 20 years as a civil servant, he's worked mainly at the Ministry of Defence. And in 2022, he was on the Operations and Crisis team in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Matthew, welcome back. Good to see you again. Let's talk about the presidential elections in the United States. To start with, what does the Trump victory mean for Ukraine in the final months of Biden's presidency and in the immediate aftermath?
Afternoon. I think the first thing it means is, both for Ukraine and actually a lot of the international partners of Ukraine, a lot of uncertainty. There's been a considerable amount of interest in Trump's position on this, going back to before the invasion, his relationship with Vladimir Putin, his views on Russia. What he has said, of course, is partly rhetorical flourish, but partly a statement of his stance, and that is he would bring an early end to the current conflict. He talked about doing it within 24 hours. That feels like the rhetorical flourish bit, but clearly he has said that he wants to end the war. I think the challenge for Ukraine is that what details have emerged, and it's important to note this is largely from people sort of around Trump, and there's always a degree of speculation on how much is actually him. It sounds like some kind of deal to freeze it, not in a dissimilar position to where it is at the moment. And that would not be very favourable to the Ukrainians. It would place a lot of constraints on their future, some of which we can talk about. And I think in many respects, that would give Russia a lot more flexibility, both in terms of achieving their objectives, but also leaving the Ukrainians vulnerable to future Russian interest.
On the campaign trail, Donald Trump refused to say whether he wanted Ukraine to win the war. Do we actually know what he wants?
To some respects, probably no. I think if we look back at how Trump handled Ukraine before the full-scale invasion, obviously, which took place after he'd left office, he was quite mixed on it. His supporters would point out that he actually gave the Ukrainians anti-tank weapons that had been provided under the Obama administration, and he did provide support to Ukraine, and indeed took action more broadly against Russia, for example, after the Skripal attacks, in terms of expelling Russian intelligence officers. At the same time, he clearly had a sort of what some people call a kind of fascination with Putin as a strong man. He, for various reasons, downplayed the US intelligence community's assessment of Russian intent. And also his first impeachment came about as a result of effectively his attempts to, if you like, extort Zelensky for domestic US political gain. So he has both supported Ukraine and actually not been tremendously helpful towards it previously. That's a slightly long-winded way of saying what he wants on Ukraine is probably not dissimilar from what he wants in many other foreign policy areas, a boost to US interests. And that's where, if you like, the wider US perspective on its global interests and the mood, particularly amongst the broader Republican Party, probably come into play.
And do you think he will be in a rush to do a deal over Ukraine? And if so, what does that mean not only for Ukraine, but European security? And can he force a deal on the President Zelensky?
The answer is no, he can't force it in sort of straight terms, but he can. The US position is enormously important for the sustainability of support to Ukraine. So to sort of break that down into various pieces, Europe provides about as much, or has pledged about as much military aid by value as the US has, but it hasn't delivered all of it. And most of the high performance and large volume weapons and systems that are being provided are coming from the US. There's little prospect in the short term that Europe could step up and completely compensate for the US aid tapering off or even being prematurely ended. So Ukraine's ability to resist rests in huge part upon US support. If that aid disappeared overnight, that doesn't necessarily mean Ukraine surrenders. This is largely existential for them, but it would have a significant impact on what operations they could conduct and essentially over what kind of frontage. So would they have to pull back? Would they have to consolidate? Would they have to operate at a lower tempo? It would be a big blow. I mean, I doubt Ukrainians would just throw in the towel, but it would then create a long-term problem for them. So he can't make them negotiate, but if they see the writing on the wall, they may have to compromise at an unfavourable time. There is the alternative, and this is the mercurial part. If you're Zelensky, and he was one of the first to congratulate Trump, you might hope that Trump wants to be seen as a winner, that, cutting a deal would be a huge bonus for his way of doing business. And one way to do that would be to open the taps, to somehow force more equipment into the system, to remove some of the caveats on long-range weapons, and, if you like, show that their policy of peace through strength can mean the strength of allies and partners backed by the US. Now, I'm not sure that is really going to come to pass, but that's what Zelensky will probably be hoping.
So he's hoping that President Trump, when he is president, will be considering those options. What do you think might push him in that direction?
The question of, is he the president who lost Ukraine, might weigh heavily on his position. So the argument that he came in, Ukraine's position collapsed soon afterwards, does he really want to be the one who wears that, would be one factor. If you have people like Mike Pompeo, prominent in the new administration, and some others who are big supporters of Ukraine, they might advocate for more support to Ukraine as part of a strong Republican overseas policy. And the desire to get an early result. Set against that, you have a lot more skepticism amongst the Republicans about the value of supporting Ukraine. There is, frankly, a little bit of sort of a slightly strange set of people who are enamored of Russia because they follow a kind of realist foreign policy. The vice president, of course, has been far more skeptical in setting out his position on the value of support to Ukraine. And then there is the thing that doesn't often go acknowledged, but is a common factor across US foreign policy, which is the need to focus on the Indo-Pacific and the rise of China. And you have a range of, if you like, Republican strategists, but also people who are in the national security sphere, who have been raising the alarm on Chinese rearmament, who think that Europe's a distraction and, frankly, Europe should step up.
And when you look, you said earlier about Trump wanting to be seen as the president who lost Ukraine. If you look at the legacy under the Biden administration and its escalation aversion, the slow decision making, the equivocation over weapons permissions and support, the lack of strategy, it was actually, you could argue, pushing Ukraine down the road towards defeat. This could be seen by Donald Trump as an opportunity.
Yes, I think there are plenty in the current administration who would quibble with that characterization in terms of the inevitable endpoint. But it is certainly the case that the current trajectory, the current speed at which support arrives, is negative for Ukraine. They are losing ground slowly. I think the caveat is a significant proportion of that relates to personnel issues. The number of people that the Ukrainians have recruited, mobilized, and trained, and that is input measurement that is not really in the gift of international backers. I mean, they can do some of the training outside the country, but if they can't mobilize enough people, they cannot overcome the Russian advantage in numbers at the moment. And that's regardless of material.
And if you look at the situation on the battlefield at the moment, in the last few days, the Ministry of Defence in Britain has assessed that Russian forces have made battlefield gains of some 9 kilometres along parts of the front line in Donetsk. What is driving that push right now? Some have said the US elections, some have said it's taking advantage of Ukrainian weaknesses, others just a rush before the weather conditions change.
I think that is the continued erosion of the Ukrainian position and the Russian willingness to keep pressing fundamentally. I mean, it's true it's happening in the election window and that winter is approaching. But I think what it ultimately seems to reflect, and researchers who've been out to the front line and are reporting back, is the cumulative impact of still an advantage in artillery, still having a lot of surveillance over the front line, numbers being a problem, and the Ukrainians being exhausted in many places. There are units that have not been withdrawn from the front line as a whole unit for months, if not a couple of years. There are units that are not receiving replacements fast enough or at all. And there are areas where they are trying to hold on to unfavourable positions that result in them taking slow losses. And those things are all coming together and have resulted in this sort of slight acceleration in Russian advances. And that's coming at a huge cost, but they are still moving forward.
Your colleague, Jack Watling, recently wrote that the Kremlin believes it can achieve its objectives in Ukraine militarily. Can you just walk us through the capabilities that Russia's recent battlefield advances have rested on?
So it is a combination of numbers and some slightly counterintuitive tactics. So when we looked back at the Ukrainian counteroffensive, one of the challenges was that they weren't able to operate in sufficiently large numbers, combining all of their capabilities together, combined arms maneuver. And that was a source of some criticism. The Russians have been operating in very small numbers, like handfuls of people, dismounted infantry, attacking, in multiple places and sustaining that kind of pressure. And that's what's leading to their casualties. But what that means is there's no let up for the Ukrainians. So it's not hugely sophisticated, but it's making maximum use of their numbers. They've combined that with this very significant surveillance drone coverage, which means it's very hard to move around without being fundamentally spotted or then struck with artillery. Ukrainian strong points are still subject to heavy attack by glide bombs, which are massive explosive devices which can really kind of demolish defences. They make it very difficult to stay in buildings. And then you've got a sort of combination of longer range artillery and volume of fire which can be brought in. And because the Ukrainians are largely static, they are having to hunker down and sort of weather this storm. And there's a final problem, which is defences. Now, I think it's worth switching our gaze slightly north and noting that the Kursk incursion has probably shrunk in size by about 50%. That's because they've been there for less time. They haven't been able to dig in as extensively in terms of defences, and therefore they're even more vulnerable to this sort of incoming fire.
Do you think that the occupation that Ukraine has actually achieved in Kursk at the moment is then under threat, and perhaps they may be pushed out within a certain, I don't know, what time scale?
I honestly don't know what the time scale for that, if you like, being forced back would be. A significant chunk of it depends on the extent to which the Ukrainians want to hold on to that. for these negotiations that they fear might be coming, or if they want to try and preserve the force. The numbers on Ukrainian casualties there show they've lost a lot of equipment. And that is the area, of course, where the alleged, reported North Korean reinforcements have gone. It's not a huge number, but it's enough to add pressure back in Russia, which means the Russians can keep larger numbers elsewhere. I remember saying at the time, I didn't think the Ukrainians would want to hold on to this incursion for more than a couple of months, because they would begin to come under pressure and they would begin to, if you like, bleed out. That now looks like it's happening. And so there's a real question over the value of sustaining what is now a shrinking enclave.
And Ukraine's Defence Minister, Rustem Umerov, says the North Korean troops appear to have been mixed in with the Russian army. The ISW assesses they will primarily be used by Russia to repel Ukrainian forces in Kursk. And I suppose the fear from Zelensky's position is that more will be coming. And he's also urging the foreign community to allow those long-range weapon strikes into Russia, saying he has pinpointed places where those North Korean troops are being based. Do you think there will be any movement on that, or is he just using this as an opportunity to ask the same question again, but in a different way?
To a degree, I think he's making 2 points there. One is about the long-range strike weapons. It's worth noting that many of those Korean forces could be in range of the HIMARS rocket artillery already, and the Ukrainians have already got permission to use those, and they could quite happily use them to strike the North Koreans. So it feels like what he's doing there is trying to tack together the other issue about things like ATACMS, which would be useful, and Storm Shadow. I mean, I think I've said previously that Storm Shadow is best used against a particular set of targets. It's unlikely that there are many suitable targets amongst the North Koreans that you would use Storm Shadow against, but he's trying to kind of force that point home. I think the other thing that he's doing by emphasizing this is that even though it's a relatively small number of troops, it is a widening of the conflict on behalf of Russia using international partners. And I think there's a fair question to be asked, why is it that Russia can do this? Russia can take Iranian Shahed drones and fire them into Ukrainian cities, and yet there is continued concern over what happens if the mirror took place. And it's not even the mirror. I mean, nobody is talking about deploying a NATO brigade into Ukraine to fight Russian forces on the front line. And yet it appears that international partners are the ones who have been concerned about escalation. I mean, this is an escalation by international partners of Russia. There might be more to come. I mean, we don't really know. But I think by continuing to keep it in the public eye, Zelensky is pointing out what feels like an unequal relationship now in terms of international support, even in spite of the fact that there's billions still coming in. And I think I should have mentioned earlier, one other potential consequence of Trump being elected is that President Biden might choose to use all of the remaining authorization that he's got to accelerate and expand in the next 2 months military support.
At the moment, Russia seems to be willing to tolerate the cost of the war in terms of casualty as on the battlefield, and also the financial cost of the country back home. Do you agree with the analysts who say Russia cannot sustain the war effort at this current level beyond 2025? And if so, how would you prepare for that moment and prevent a disingenuous ceasefire offering at that point?
So the first thing is that Russia's historically shown an incredibly high tolerance for pain and cost. The estimates of how much of their economy is now supporting the war effort or one form or another have skyrocketed. It's a significant percentage. People are talking over 30% now. The arrival of North Korean troops, I think, is a useful boon, but not vital, although they do want to reduce the pressure on their need for further mobilization. What we do see is that in material terms, the weapons of war, equipment, all of those sorts of things, they have been overwhelmingly refurbishing equipment up until now. And the rough estimate from our researchers and others is that by the time we get deep into 2025, summer and later in the year, they will be pretty close to expending all of their old supplies of tanks, of artillery barrels, of other things, armoured vehicles. And at some point then, they've got to start making new artillery barrels, which are complicated, and new armoured vehicles, and all of these other things. And that creates a potential vulnerability in two cases. First of all, they've got to keep up production at a pretty high rate to replace losses. Otherwise, their battlefield availability just drops. The second thing is it's another area where effective enforcement of sanctions could really hurt. We've just released a research project with some partners, which pointed out there are still elements of the artillery chain, the propellant, the materials that go into making barrels, that could be sanctioned, or rather, there are sanctions in place, but they're not being effectively enforced, that could really cut the supply, ending up on the front line. And when you combine that with Ukrainian deep strikes with their own drones, which are hitting ammunition storage, they could begin to hit a crunch. The problem is the current trend is such that there's a danger that Russia begins to make much more accelerated advances before they hit that crunch point.
Today, the UK has announced 56 new sanctions aimed at disrupting the supply of equipment for Putin's war machine. It's become the first country also to directly sanction the Russian-backed Africa Corps. It was timed to coincide with this meeting of the European political community set up in the wake of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine taking place in Hungary. President Zelensky is there. What else can he get from this, and how effective? I mean, these sanctions, these 56. Whenever I hear this, I kind of think, why didn't it happen before? What can you tell us about the timing of this, and what more President Zelensky can get from it?
So the sanctions. I mean, the timing is obviously important in terms of showing continued political support from European partners for Ukraine. There's I'm occasionally a bit of a skeptic on what sanctions can achieve overall. They are not good at, on their own, forcing a country to back down. And that's because countries tend to develop evasion techniques and routes. But targeted sanctions can identify elements of a system, finance or material, that you can begin to pick apart and actually increase the pressure on a particular component. So I wouldn't say these sanctions will really bring an end to Russia's war, even though they're still targeting the war machine. But those that really pick at specific elements of the system, and I haven't looked through the latest list, can, if they're combined with enforcement activity, make a material impact. But a lot of this is fundamentally political signalling. I mean, I think the problem is that the mood music that's coming out of Kyiv at the moment is that thank you very much for the political signalling, but what I need is artillery, air defences, long-term financial support, and a change in permissions or a changed position on escalation rather than nice words.
And when you said earlier on, when we first started talking about the future and talking about what potential influence President Trump will have on this situation, you talked about the implications for Ukraine if the US withdraws its support and tries to force upon it this kind of these frozen lines, as it were. I mean, that is pretty unthinkable for President Zelensky, not least so because of the occupied territories and what would happen to the people, the Ukrainians who are there right now, who are suffering terribly. Can you just explain how it would actually play out exactly in theory? I mean, I know it's nothing that's actually been agreed at all, but what is the thinking on that?
Well, I mean, I think the problem is it's difficult to see how that would play out in both practical and political terms. I mean, politically, it's near unthinkable for the Ukrainians to accept that. So the Russians at the moment, would either want to join up if you like, the four oblasts where they dominate. Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. That includes holding Crimea. That would be an enormous chunk of Ukraine gone. That would be essentially rewarding the Russians for the invasion. Even freezing the line where it is and having some kind of demilitarized zone would put things in a very unfavorable position for the Ukrainians. Let's say they evened up the territory in the north. So they gave back the territory in Kursk, and that was swapped for the Russian lodgment just north of Kyiv, maybe a couple of other places. That leaves them with a very awkward front line. They would argue it leaves them not well placed in the face of future Russian aggression. There would need to be some kind of security guarantee. And how would you enforce that? Would you be basing international forces in Ukraine as a tripwire? And fundamentally, it means saying goodbye to a massive chunk of the country and a population where the evidence that's come up so far, quite apart from fundamentally war crimes being committed by Russian troops, but the erasure of Ukrainian culture and society, changes in language use. There are obviously some parts of the country where Russian has been popular for a long time, but the Russians have extended that area. They have obviously had this kidnapping campaign to take children out into Russia proper, and they have been raising sites of significance to the Ukrainians. Like it would be wholly unacceptable. It would be difficult to see Zelensky or a future Ukrainian government agreeing to that. That could only come if there was the fear of future and imminent pressure that would take even more territory. I mean, it really would be a pretty dire situation for the Ukrainians if they were accepting any of those terms.
Let's turn to NATO now, and what you think Donald Trump as president would do. What would his impact be on NATO? Would he make it stronger or weaker?
We have the trouble of parsing the difference between what Trump says and what he means. And that's not just a line that his defenders have used. It reflects the reality of not everything that he said in his first term was actually implemented. In fact, the majority of it wasn't. So John Bolton, for example, his former national security advisor, says he thinks Trump will try and pull the US out of NATO. There's a question of what that actually means, because there is no exit mechanism in NATO. But he could do the equivalent of quiet quitting if all the American officers were withdrawn from their posts or they pulled out of the command structure and basically didn't turn up for work. Or is it a rhetorical flourish to get other people to increase their defense spending, which Trump can then claim credit for? And that would be quite similar to what happened in his first term, which is that there was already a 2% spending target. Countries were already increasing their spending. But I think it's pretty clear that Trump's diplomacy, if you want to call it that, really encouraged people to up that, or at least make a show of upping that, even more so, in spite of the fact that they had started doing it. So one of the questions is, maybe he's just trying to get a strong NATO because that is in America's interests, because that then actually enables him to say, look, Europe is better defended because I made the Europeans spend more money. Now I can move US forces off to the Indo-Pacific and we can deal with the challenge of China. The big problem is that the uncertainty that his partners say is part of his foreign policy is harmful to some of what NATO does and how it operates, which is the question of, would the US defend Europe in the event of a Russian attack on a NATO member?
And indeed, and during the campaign trail, but during the campaign trail, well, he said things like that President Putin could do whatever the hell he likes, inverted commas, to a country, an alliance member that's not paying its 2% of GDP towards defence. That in itself, I mean, I don't know what President Putin would make of that comment at all, or take it at his word. And I don't suppose any of us know whether what he says is what he means anyway.
US complaints about European defence spending are as old as NATO itself. So it is entirely fair to say there have been complaints going back years, including various American officials and presidents, if you like, appearing to cast doubt on Article 5. The thing is that in the majority of cases, it is because of the level of US involvement in entanglement, it has generally been assumed that they would. Again, Trump defenders would say, well, but actually the number of US forces in Europe slightly increased during his first administration, which is true. The problem is, I think a lot of people are confusing uncertainty with ambiguity. That sounds like dancing on the head of a pin, but what I really mean is that in deterrence, you create your red line or your conditions where consequences will be triggered. And then what you want potentially is a bit of ambiguity beneath that, so that not only does your adversary not cross that line, but they don't go too near it. The problem is that Trump's rhetoric and the way that he's specifically talked about defending Europe has not just created ambiguity, but actually uncertainty as to whether he would do so in the case the red line was crossed. And that is the problem for Europe.
And Donald Trump often been described as a disruptor. You could say that he has that in common with President Putin, President Xi, Kim Jong-un, Benjamin Netanyahu. In today's world, what is the risk of that, instead of ending wars, more likely to provoke the next one?
I think his supporters are the claim made often is no wars in his first term. And I think the problem with that is that people in Raqqa or Syria or Crimea or most of Ukraine would rightly point out that wars were still waged and people still died. Of course, what they really mean is no new wars. There were no new ones started. I would say we had a near miss with the Iranians, a very mixed US policy on Iran. Things weren't exactly successful with North Korea. It is true that kind of madman factor, as it's sometimes called, it's not, I don't mean pejoratively about Trump, but the idea that unpredictability creates uncertainty in your adversary and therefore they're more wary, assumes that they don't think the interests are more in their favor. And so bluntly, they take risks. We've seen the Iranians take risks. Iranians were prepared to attack US personnel while Trump was in office, even after Soleimani was killed. That's the head of the Quds Force. So I don't think there are any guarantees. And there's a degree to which he's sold the pass by making such a great play of no new wars being started, that you might see someone like North Korea or Iran or Russia ask themselves, well, if I just do a small act, will he really start a new war over this small act? And so I think the problem is that the peace through strength argument needs to reckon with decision-making by people who are more prepared to take risk.
Matthew Savil, it's been great talking to you. Thank you so much for your time. You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. My thanks to our producers today, Louis Sykes and Morgan Burdick, and for you for watching. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now, or you can listen to Times Radio for the latest news and in-depth analysis, or go to thetimes.co.uk. For now, though, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.